muy buenas. Bienvenidos amigos a las charlas del ático, que hoy tenemos el placer de inaugurar con una invitada de excepción, Julia Boyd, reconocida historiadora y autora del éxito internacional Viajeros en el Tercer Reich, mejor libro del año para el Daily Telegraph, libro de historia del año para Los Angeles Times, mejor libro para los lectores de The Guardian, top 3 en las listas de bestsellers del Sunday Times y también un gran éxito aquí en España, Viajeros en el Tercer Reich. Pero este es el libro anterior de Julia Boyd. Hoy vamos a estar sobre todo hablando, también por supuesto, de viajeros, pero principalmente de un pueblo en el Tercer Reich, en este nuevo libro que Julia Boyd ha coescrito junto a Angélica Patel. Julia y Angélica reconstruyen con precisión y humanidad cómo el nazismo se infiltró en la vida cotidiana de un pueblito bávaro, Oberstdorf, atrapando en su red de miedo, lealtades y tragedias a ciudadanos corrientes. Este libro también es magnífico, maravilloso. Lo acabamos de sacar este lunes, ya está, por lo tanto, disponible en librerías. Ha sido el libro del año para The New Statesman, libro del año para Waterstones y, bueno, con la inconfundible capacidad de Julia y Angélica para convertir la gran historia en relatos cercanos y profundamente humanos. Ambas nos invitan a reflexionar sobre los dilemas morales de una época oscura que, bueno, pues hoy en día sigue resonando y teniendo impacto. Julia, it's a pleasure being with you here. We are going to have a fantastic interview. Yeah, so let's go straight with the questions. So first question, Julia, how did the idea come to you about to tell the story of the Third Reich through a small village like Oberstdorf rather than, say, through major political figures?
Well, I'd have to say straight away, it wasn't actually my idea. After I wrote Travellers in the Third Reich, I met this very nice German lady who lives in Oberstdorf and whose family has been there many generations. And the village had, in fact, written a book written by my friend Kati Patel, on the history of the village during the Second World War, during the Third Reich. But it's a village, and they have a very good archives there and so on, but they felt that they wanted the story of Oberstdorf to reach a wider public. And so that's where I came in, and Kati asked me if I would write it. Well, I have to say, to begin with, I wasn't terribly keen because I thought it's very difficult for an English person who doesn't even speak very good German, never heard of Oberstdorf, to write about its history at such a difficult time. Anyway, very, very, very tricky. But I thought it, and also I thought Oberstdorf is the most southern village in Germany. It's in the Bavarian Alps. It was out of the action. What would Oberstdorf have to say about the Second World War or the Third Reich? Well, I couldn't have been more wrong about that, because actually Oberstdorf, there's really no aspect of the Third Reich or the Second World War that didn't touch Oberstdorf. So I went to the village and I was persuaded, and I thought, well, I'll give it my best shot. And then, of course, you get sucked in, and I became very involved in the village and its history. And indeed, I met a lot of the people who live there now.
Great. Yeah, so as you say, Oberstdorf seems to be like an idyllic, isolated place with mountains, tourism, strong tradition. So what was it like to discover that such a peaceful community became entangled in the Nazi machinery like so hard?
Well, I think the central point to make here is that the Nazis, their tentacles went into every corner of society. Nowhere was left untouched. And Oberstdorf, although it was a village that had largely survived on agriculture and the cattle, and it was an agricultural society, and life was very hard for them. But even before the First World War, it had become a very popular tourist resort. People went there for winter sports and for climbing and walking in the summer. So it was used to having visitors from northern Germany and so on.
And I guess all kinds of visitors. I mean, maybe
all kinds of visitors. I'd have to say a lot of Jewish visitors. So they were not really into this anti-Jewish thing. And in fact, it's a very Catholic society. And the great majority of Hitler's followers were actually Protestant. But so to begin with, they weren't really that keen on the Nazis. But again, I think one has to remember the political context. After the First World War, Germany was absolutely on its knees. There was the grief, there was insurrection, there was starvation. But funnily enough, one of the things that mattered most to the German people was the loss of pride. They'd been, since 1871, it had been a nation, and they were growing, they were acquiring an empire, they were becoming a top nation. And then suddenly that all went. And for a lot of people, they didn't understand why. And the Treaty of Versailles came as a terrible shock to them. They were made to feel a complete pariah, and people minded about pride. So fast forward to the 1930s, and suddenly here comes on the scene a man who is going to give Germany its pride back. It's going to sock it to those foreigners who keep demanding reparations and this and that. It's going to give pride back to the nation. And I think that was a very strong component. Of course, there were other things. I mean, Hitler was very clever. He knew how to get the youth on side. And there were things like the Kraft durch Freude, which was an organization which gave thousands of working class Germans a wonderful holiday on cruise ships, in spas, things that they could never have dreamt of. And there was social housing built and so on. So all these things helped to persuade people that Hitler was the man of the moment. Now, things are never as black or white as we assume. And I think that there were many people who definitely had doubts, didn't like the Nazis. They may have supported Hitler, but they didn't like the people around them. They were too noisy and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But they still voted for Hitler because they thought Hitler was the man who was going to put Germany back where it belonged.
Yeah, but they had that belief in Hitler, but before like the election. But after the election, well, they saw what Hitler was up to, and they kept on giving his support to him. So why that? I mean, I would say the key question here is like, how does a normal village, a normal society, turns into a nasty village, an extremistic society? Yeah,
well, I think Oberstdorf is a very good model for a state of affairs that was probably true across the country. Now, before the war, Oberstdorf had a population of 4,000. But within that small population, there was, it spread across the whole political spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you had real Nazis who really loved the Nazi party, were absolutely pro-Hitler and everything. At the other end of the spectrum, you had people like the Neuchel family who were mountaineers and foresters and were real people of the mountains. They hated Hitler. They were part of the National Socialist Party. But I think the majority of people were probably somewhere in the middle. They were people who, as I've just been describing, wanted Germany to be great again, and they wanted Hitler to succeed in making Germany a successful independent nation. But the election on the 5th of March in 1933, a lot of people thought they didn't really like anti-Semitism, they didn't like this, they didn't like that. But once Hitler was in power, they were sure that he would calm down and things would become much more normal. Of course, the reverse happened. And after that election, Hitler lost no time in introducing draconian measures like the Enabling Act, which gave him power to put anybody in prison he wanted to. And then, which affected Oberstdorf even more, came the Equalization Act. And that really was this business of putting tentacles into every corner of society. Oberstdorf, like many German villages and towns, had many societies, from flower collecting to gliding to mushroom picking, you name it. It was part of German society. And every society after the Equalization Act had to rewrite its constitution so that they would always begin by hailing Hitler, no Jews would be allowed. and so on. And so that is how the Nazis and Hitler managed to get absolutely under the skin of even the smallest communities.
Yeah, because one interesting thing about your book is that you doesn't present Nazis as the monster from the outside, but as neighbors, teachers, or even children. So how difficult was it to write about those gray zones without falling into justification? Yeah.
Well, of course, I didn't actually finish that sentence. I was saying that you get Nazis at one end of the spectrum and anti-Nazis at the other. But what I was really going on to say was that in the middle, and probably the majority of the village, you had people who started out supporting Hitler, but then after that election, which I've just described, changed their minds. Like the mayor of Oberstdorf, the second mayor, was a chimney sweep called Ludwig Fink. And he's a really interesting character, as indeed is the headmaster of the secondary school, because I think both men illustrate what happened across Germany. They started off supporting Hitler for the reasons I've outlined. But then, when they saw what was really happening, they saw the reality of it, they changed their minds. But you couldn't change your mind. After that March the 5th election, you know, the Enabling Act, which I just mentioned, anybody could be put into what they called protective custody, which might mean going to Dachau, which opened in 1933, just a few weeks after the election. It was 100 miles away from Oberstdorf, near Munich. And certainly the villagers would have heard what was going on there. So there was an absolute terror. And even if you were brave enough to criticize Hitler or protest and risk imprisonment or even death, what about your family? If you lost your job, if you were put in prison, that would put you at risk. And Mayor Fink, for instance, Ludwig Fink, one son who was epileptic. And so, you know, I think the advantage of looking at one small community in depth is that you tease out these complexities. You begin to see it not as a great sort of national statement. Why didn't the Germans protest? Why didn't they stand up to Hitler when they saw the reality of Nazi rule? But then when you look at it at the micro level, you begin to understand much more how difficult it was. And there were so many other factors. So I think most people just gritted their teeth and said, well, there's nothing I can do. I'll keep my head down and hope the war is over as soon as possible. And I'd have to add to that really until 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, most people, even the people who didn't really like the Nazis, were proud to see Germany's victories. They applauded the Blitzkrieg. They felt proud again of their country. And the turning point was really Barbarossa, when Germany went into Russia. Then people were terrified. And after that, of course, it was, you know, more or less a downhill ride for the Germans.
So did the Nazis lose support when the war was going on, or just till the end? And it was
as I say, it was really Russia, because then, I mean, take Oberstdorf again. This is why looking at one small community is so useful, because for the first 18 months or so of the war, they lost very few soldiers, only a handful. And there were all these victories. But then, once they went into Russia, by Christmas 1941, they'd lost, dozens of soldiers under the most horrible conditions. And there was, you know, Hitler had persuaded the German people, who were nervous of a war, but he'd persuaded them by promising them a victory that would be very swift and complete. And would be, you know, over in a few months. But once they went into Russia, they got bogged down in the winter, and then there was more rationing, and people were dying. It was a very different picture, and that's when people began to realize this was not going to be a quick, easy victory, and in fact, they might well actually lose the war. So the mood changed very much after after Russia, after the Russian invasion.
Yeah, and eventually, if I remember it well, there was like a kind of coup in Oberstdorf, like to overthrow the Nazis.
That was right at the end of the war, yes.
Yeah.
That was
Tell
an
us, tell
amazing
us more, really.
story. Yeah, I mean, that was real sort of movie stuff,
Yeah.
because even people who had supported Hitler realized that, that it was hopeless. Mind you, there were still hardcore Nazis in the village, and Nazis escaping from the north down to the mountains. So just before the end of the war, Oberstdorf was a cauldron of different views. There were people who wanted to war to come to an end as quickly as possible. There were people who wanted to fight to the bitter end and beyond. And it must have been terrifying. But amazingly, they managed to get together a whole lot of men who went into the village at midnight, captured all the Nazis, put them in prison, managed to negotiate with the Allies. So when the French came in, instead of bombarding Oberstdorf and destroying the village, they managed to surrender peacefully.
Well, yeah. Yeah. So let's talk also like a little bit on your previous book, because your previous book, Travels in the Third Reich, gave voice to foreigners who witnessed Hitler's Germany firsthand. So how did that experience prepare you for writing A Village in the Third Reich, which is a different
It's
process?
very interesting because they looked at this whole period from very different perspectives. I was the first book, Travelers in the Third Reich, was looking at how people, what the impressions they got of Germany, whereas The Village was taking a deep dive into one community. So they're very different, but the same period. But the thing that I've written books on different subjects, but in a sense, my approach is always the same. What I like to do is to find unpublished sources, letters, diaries, memoirs, stuck in people's suitcases or in obscure archives. And you dig those out. And then I try to weave them into the bigger picture so that I think it makes it, I mean, I do this for myself because to understand something as huge as the Third Reich, I mean, it was the most appalling conflict, I think, in human history. And to try and get across what that meant is very difficult if you're looking at it a big canvas. But if you're looking at it through the eyes of individuals, it's easier to identify. And I think the question that I was always asking myself, whether as a traveler in Nazi Germany or as a villager living in Oberstdorf, I was always trying to think, what would I have done? How would I have behaved? Because hindsight, looking back at history from the safe knowledge of what's happened, it changes perspectives completely. So I was trying to recapture a sense of what it would have been like as a British person, American, or a Chinese student, or a French person, what it was like traveling in Germany during the 30s. And to get a sense of, because of course, perceptions changed. I think a lot of people understood why Hitler behaved the way he did. He was trying to achieve something, and a lot of Europe was in the Depression, there was unemployment, and Hitler was, to many people, looked as if he was doing something to try and put his country back into good shape. But I think after the Nuremberg rally in 1935, when Jews were stripped of their nationality, I think by 1935, there was enough evidence to show the Nazis in their true colors. But up until then, you can sort of understand why people even admired Hitler. After that, I think it's more difficult. And the fact that British people, for instance, were still traveling in Nazi Germany right up to before the war, I find horrifying. But I found it a very revealing for myself too, because I was born in 1948. And so I grew up with the background of the war. My parents had fought in it. I used to play on a bomb site and so on. All my friends' parents had fought in it. So I think, this trying to explore how people felt traveling to Germany in the 1930s gave me a lot of insight and understanding of of how it could have all happened, which is, of course, what we're all trying to understand is, how could this have happened? How could people have fallen for Hitler?
Yeah, and also what does being human means, because sometimes when we look at history, we think like, well, they are distant times, distant people, we have nothing to do with them. But many occasions, well, they are human
Yes.
Yeah, and that's...
And things, we tend to think of things stuck in a particular mold, but of course it's changing all the time. And this is what happened to Oberstdorf. If you take the beginning of the 1930s to 1950, when, well, 55, when it got back its sovereign rights, Germany got back its sovereign rights, the ups and downs, the changes of perspective, the changes of vision and reaction, of course, evolved and changed. So I was trying to capture something of that in both books, really. I was trying to understand, trying to get a better understanding of how this terrible horror and tragedy for human beings, for the whole planet, could have happened.
Yeah. So in your book, there are a lot of deeply human stories, which is like some of the most moving ones for you.
Oh, I think the one that brings tears to my eyes, even talking about it. And also, this is, of course, since the sun has suddenly come out, just going to move.
You look great, don't worry.
I think that this is interesting because, of course, it was a German victim. Hitler introduced this euthanasia program, and he wanted to get rid of people who were disabled, who had mental problems, or didn't fit the Nazi model. And so this was very early gassing. He gassed disabled people. And there was a grandson of the very good mayor of Oberstdorf in the First World War. He was born blind. And I followed his story in great detail. His great niece gave me a lot of family private information. And he was a very talented boy. He was a brilliant musician. But he was taken away in one of the notorious grey ambulances. And with other children and young people, they were all shoved into a gas chamber and gassed. And afterwards, their gold teeth, if they had any, would have been removed from them. This was Hitler doing this to Germans, So I find that, and the description of the, right at the end of the war, when the Allies were making progress, they made all the inmates of Auschwitz march further west, and they marched to Theresienstadt, which was a concentration camp near Prague. And there were people in Prague, including one lady from Oberstdorf, who described these people as they arrived. And that, I had to stop. I had to go and walk in the park. I mean, some of the things you read, and then just the general distress of people, the horror of it all, the sheer, utter horror. And, there was one man from Oberstdorf who was called Heinz Schubert, who claimed to be descended from the composer's family. And he was responsible for killing 700 gypsies in Crimea. He had to organize it. And at his Nuremberg trial, he said, and this stuck in my head forever, he said, "We thought we were saving Western civilization." But you have to understand, these young men were absolutely brainwashed. The Germans were so clever at capturing German youth. And they made them feel they were doing wonderful things for their country. And they'd grown up knowing the horrors of the First World War. And it gave them great pride. And they were completely brainwashed. There wasn't YouTube, there wasn't the internet or newspapers. And so a man like Heinz Schubert, who probably wasn't a very nice human being, I've no idea, but he probably really thought that he was saving Western civilization. And that is truly a terrifying thought. It wasn't Jews, it was gypsies he was responsible for killing.
Yeah. But also, well, we are talking about bad things in the book, but also in the book there are like voices of quiet resistance, nuns,
Yes.
silent socialists, people
Absolutely.
helping other, risking their lives. Yeah, tell us also.
Could not agree with you more. And I think it's very easy to just dwell on the horrors, and there are plenty of horrors. But for all the horrors, there are these individual acts of bravery and courage and humanity. And they are so important because they do happen in the most horrific conditions. And one has to hang on to those. And there's even a bit of humor. One of the stories that touched me deeply was the Oberstdorfers were a very tight Catholic community, and they loved their church and they loved their church bells. But all the church bells were suddenly ordered to be sent away to be melted down into weapons, unless they were historic or they had a certain amount of silver in them. So what the silversmith in Oberstdorf did, they gouged out a bit of the bell and put silver coins in. It must have been very obvious what they'd done. And these bells in the middle of the war were sent all the way up to Cologne to be inspected. And clearly the guy who looked was a Catholic too, because the Rhineland was Catholic. And it must have been obvious what they'd done, but he sent the bell back saying it had too much silver in it to be melted down. But that's a charming story. So you're right to say one must never lose faith in humanity. And even in its darkest, bleakest moments, there are always signs that human beings will be human.
That saved the Bell's lives, so to speak, but there were also people risking their lives to save all the people's lives, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I hope I'm not talking too much.
No. I mean, it's perfect. Yeah. And you work in this book with Angelika Pachel, and her family comes from Oberstdorf. So what did her local and personal perspective bring to the project? Yeah.
Well, I couldn't have written the book without her. She the village had formed a committee because they felt they must write about this painful part of their history before all the people who had experienced it died. So Cathy was able to interview a lot of people who had actually lived through the war in about 2010. So, and you couldn't, as a British person, have gone to that village and say, I'm going to write your history. Yeah. I couldn't have done it without Cathy and the support of the whole village. So it would have been impossible. But my book was very different to the village book, to her book, because I did a lot of fresh research and built. She wrote a very, very interesting book full of extraordinary facts and things that I wouldn't have had access to without it. But building on that, I produced something that was a different book, I suppose, and perhaps more accessible to foreigners, which was Cathy's idea. She wanted people in other countries to be able to. I think she felt that if they read Oberstdorf's story, it would help everybody have a better idea of where Germans were coming from and how it could have happened.
Yeah. So also I would say that many readers will find parallels with current debates, hypocrisy, populism, fear. So to what extent is the book a warning to us?
Well, I'm afraid warnings never seem to work, but I have been chilled because when I was writing this book, which was some time ago now, it was before recent history, the invasion of Ukraine and Trump and everything. And I never thought that I would be living myself through a period of history that has so many parallels to what went on in the 30s. And I'll tell you a chilling story. A friend of mine was in America a few weeks ago, attending a conference, going into dinner with a very nice American she'd been talking to, who was was very senior at Harvard. And he said, "Oh, I've left my wallet behind." And she said, "Oh, I don't think you'll need it tonight." And he said, "You don't understand. We've all got contact numbers. We must contact immediately if we're arrested." And that I found very chilling because it's a real reminder of what went on in the 30s. I hope it won't come to that in America, but it is unbelievable. I never thought it would get to this stage.
Yeah. And also in Spain, there's like an ongoing debate about historical memory and how to deal with it, and with about wounds to the past. So do you see like a parallels between what you are doing, well, what you're doing in Germany, and maybe what is going on here?
I lived in Germany with my husband. He was in the British Embassy, and so we knew a lot of Germans. We were living in Bonn on the Rhineland, opposite where Hitler stayed at the top of the Siebengebirge before the war. In fact, it was while we were there in the late 70s, early 80s, that Germany really began to get to grips with its past, because to begin with, nobody talked about it. Everybody was so keen to forget all about it. And that is very sad, because a lot of history, I think, was lost. But Germany has certainly made up for it. But I think they've concentrated on, the big themes and the big cities and so on. And I think now, I didn't think about this when I was writing these books, but I think there is now more of an appetite to not talk about the big battles and the generals and the politics, but to look at how ordinary people were reacting and what motivated them and why they did the things they did. And then how, after the war was over, they managed to reinvigorate themselves and get on with life. I think it's, the story stretches from the post-First World War years right up until the mid-1950s. And so it's a huge area of human history. It's not just the war years. It's that whole slab of 20th century history.
Yeah. So we are getting close to the end of the interview. So many Spanish readers discovered you through travels in the Third Reich. So they have enjoyed it. Do you think they will also enjoy A Village in the Third Reich?
Well, I do hope so. I think it's like two sides of the same coin. Yeah. One shows how foreigners didn't do enough to stop Hitler, and the other one shows how it was possible for Germans themselves not to understand exactly what was happening. Of course, there were always going to be very dedicated Nazis. I'm not trying to pretend there weren't, but there was this middle bit, which is more nuanced. And I think one of my messages, I think my central message, having written both these books, and what was in my head all the time was, what would I have done? Yeah. And I'm pretty sure I'm a coward. I wouldn't have been brave. I wouldn't have resisted. And if I had a family, I would have done anything to protect my family. And I think what I'm hoping these books do, because I use experiences of people in real time, not looking back, I hope people will try to think what it was like to be there and then, and how they might have reacted themselves.
Yeah. So both of your books, both of those books, Travels in the Third Reich and A Village in the Third Reich, have had like a magnificent success, both critical and both selling success. So how do you explain that? What do they have of different from others' books about World War II?
I can't explain it. I am totally and utterly astonished. I had no expectation. I thought I would sell, with luck, I thought I might sell a few hundred copies. So I have no idea. I have huge imposter syndrome. Do you know what I mean by imposter syndrome? I can't explain it, and I'm very diffident about it. And
no, but they have something different. They have something different, and maybe you know what they have different, but you don't want to tell it because you're a humble person.
Well, I think it's because I asked questions that I wanted to find answers myself, maybe. And I thought that was just me. But I discovered with these books that there are lots of people out there who are asking the same questions. And I think one of the secrets, perhaps, of the success of the books has been doing it there and then, not looking back, but actually using the words of people as they were in Germany, as they were living through these years. So you get more of a sense of what it was actually like to be there at that particular time in that particular place. So maybe that's something to do with it. But I do remain surprised and, of course, very grateful and very pleased. I'm delighted.
Oh, they are both great. So last question, Julia. If you had to convince a Spanish reader in just one sentence, or to just go buy and go read the book, what would you say to convince him?
I would say, if you want to if you want to get a sense of how it felt to be an ordinary person, either as a traveller or as a villager in Oberstdorf or in Germany in these terrible years, read these books.
Okay. So, Julia, it's been a pleasure. Lo cierto es que ha sido un placer tener hoy aquí a Julia Boyd, autora de Viajeros en el Tercer Reich y de un pueblo en el Tercer Reich, que sacamos este lunes mismo. Libros magníficos que os recomendamos a todos que leáis, sobre todo si os interesa lo que es la época de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el nazismo, pero también un poco cómo se transforma pues, el mundo, pasa de ser una sociedad corriente, por así decirlo, a una sociedad extremista. Esto es sobre todo algo que vais a descubrirlo muy, muy bien en Un pueblo en el Tercer Reich, microhistoria, pero que al final nos acaba hablando de la gran historia y de las grandes historias. Julia, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bueno, pues amigos de las charlas de Ático, nos vemos en la siguiente ocasión. Chao.
Ciao.